You're listening to the Progressive Podcast. I'm your host, Max Levin. I'm joined today by my co-host, Dylan Chopin, and we have the privilege of interviewing Rotimi Adeoye. Rotimi is a MSNBC columnist, was a Senate staffer for the Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania, and a communication strategist for the American Civil Liberties Union. He also has this privilege of being a Philadelphia Eagles fan, getting to watch them go to the Super Bowl. So, let's get into it. All right. So, Rotimi, how you doing today? Obviously, been a busy week. Trump administration. We're on, God, is it only week 2? It felt like it's been like 2.5 years. My hair is starting to go gray. But I wanted to talk first and foremost about the federal funding freeze. Obviously, you saw that whole debacle. Any thoughts pressing on the...
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, guys. I'm looking forward to having a great conversation today, and I really like your podcast and have been listening to it a lot, so thank you so much for having me on. And yeah, I think the federal hiring freeze that Trump has carried out is really just another example of kind of how him and his team view the government. There's a really good memoir on Elon Musk that was written by Walter Isaacson that I had the chance to read a couple of weeks ago, really before the administration started. And there's this kind of mentality that Elon Musk views with businesses called hardcore. It's really weird, kind of stupid. And it's basically this idea that you can kind of go into institutions, businesses, excuse me, and really just mass fire everyone, and that will help the company run efficiently. This is an idea that came from the former CEO of General Electric, Jack Welch. What he used to do is go into General Electric and basically fire a ton of people, and it led to General Electric running smoothly. But the problem is the federal government is not a business. A lot of people depend on the federal government for their safety, for really vital resources. So the way that they've treated the government in this business way that you can just fire everyone and that will ultimately help the government run better is a disastrous way of thinking. And it's really disappointing to see because there are a lot of talented folks in the government that have been there for years, have really important skills, and we're going to ultimately be making our government weaker, and it's going to hurt a lot of folks.
It really is
Yeah.
something that's just hard to see. Dylan, I was going to say, I thought you had some takes on, obviously, the institutional chaos and all that just hectic nature with the, obviously, the federal firings.
Yeah, well, I did want to ask, obviously this is connected to Trump's messaging of draining the swamp, of getting rid of the establishment. How do you think this feeds as red meat to the conservative base? Does this actually, because from my perspective, it doesn't seem like it's as much of a drain the swamp kind of move tied to Project 2025 as you might think. It just seems more like asking the swamp to leave. I wonder how you think this motivates his base going forward.
Yeah, I think, he ran on this campaign that, as you said, that he was going to drain the swamp and kind of get rid of all of the extra kind of nonsense the government had, and kind of pull out the elites and all these bad folks. So I do think for his base, this is something they see and they're like, you're doing what we wanted you to do. I think you see it in a lot of different things. Like I saw some recent reporting came out today that like the Trump administration has said that like certain government officials can't have their pronouns in their bios. Like they just care about like lib owning and doing this like, oh, like we're owning the libs, we're doing all this stuff, but they don't really care about doing actual policy. And I think it's really something interesting about the Republican Party is the base wants these like very symbolic things, like cutting federal employees, taking pronouns out of bios. And on the other hand, the base of the Democratic Party wants real structural changes, want real policy. And so, sometimes I think a lot of people are always like, oh, why? How does Trump do all this stuff? And then Democrats can't do it. It's because I think the base of the party has a lot lower standards for their leadership. And so you get the situation you're in. It's always harder to build and it's easier to destroy. And I think Trump is showing that.
It's a really interesting perspective. I was going to say, so given that destroying part, one of the things that I've been reading is obviously, Trump was elected to be a wrecking ball, right? Take a sledgehammer to the federal government. It seems to me like all he's doing is creating chaos. I don't see any actual substantive policy really coming out of the White House, any changes. It's just hectic memos. It's, seizures of power, like the birthright citizenship executive orders. How do you see all these things playing out with, I don't have any clever way to put it, but like a rogue executive, someone who's just clearly willing to throw out the norms?
Yeah, so there's this really interesting constitutional law theory called the unitary executive. It's basically this idea that the executive branch is expanded in a way in which they have control over certain things the legislative branch does. And this is not something that's in practice now, but what I think Trump is doing is by putting these executive orders out, he's trying to push the conversation towards embracing this concept of the unitary executive. And I think what his plan is that he can send some of these things to court and start to build a narrative in the legal system that certain aspects of policy that limit the executive branch should be changed. Great example of this is with birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship is in the text of the 14th Amendment. Even conservative judges that follow this idea called textualism, which is this idea that when you read a law, the text of the law is the most important. And that's an idea that conservatives have been following for a while. And so if you did a textualist reading, a conservative reading of the 14th Amendment, the text says that if you are born in the country and subject to the laws thereof, you become an American citizen. Pretty simple, pretty clear. But what Trump is doing is by putting an executive order banning birthright citizenship, he obviously can't change the Constitution. Presidents can't change the Constitution by executive order. But I imagine the strategy is sending it to the lower courts and starting to build this kind of narrative and story around how the executive should have more power to overturn things like that. So it's really dangerous. It's really scary because he's trying to throw the country into a constitutional crisis. And something that concerns me on this really is if the Supreme Court, which I think they will, strikes down this law and he decides that he doesn't want to follow it because the executive branch controls immigration. They control foreign policies. They have pretty wide latitude on letting people into the country determining citizenship. What if they choose not to follow the Supreme Court's order on that? And that's something that concerns me because J.D. Vance has many times quoted this line from Andrew Jackson, former president, which says basically the Supreme Court made a law, so let them enforce it, which is kind of this like, okay, they made this decision, so they should come and enforce it. And it's kind of he's basically giving a middle finger to the Supreme Court saying like, you have no real power because a lot of power comes from owning force, which is what Congress owns because they own the military. They help run the military with the president, control going to war. So I really do think that it shows that Trump is really slowly trying to erode some of our constitutional foundations.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty clear just by following the news. I do think it's somewhat harder to determine what the executive branch will do because it is very like a closed loop circle kind of group of people that are determining you're my inferior, you're going to do this, and if I tell you. But you did mention something that I think was interesting was kind of the idea of the unitary executive theory seeping into the reading and the practice of law. Obviously, we saw that introduced and really carried out by Bush 2 and then Trump's first term. But my question is, with so much of a emphasis away from that, from the Biden administration, from the Obama administration, does Trump actually have enough time for that theory to seep through to the legal system? My theory is that if you have 4 years, you're not going to change the minds of the Supreme Court and the circuit judges and the reading of the law, how it is carried out in practice. Do you think there's enough time? Do you think he has enough willpower to actually get this kind of centralized authority in the executive branch over just the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point and caveat. Obviously, time is limited with the president. Some say that, you really only have 100 days because then the midterm starts and then everything starts to become like, should you do this? You got like people in swing states that get nervous about signing on certain things. So I do agree with that point. But I think what they're trying to do, and this is something that Republicans have been doing for a long time on ideas and issues, is building the argument consistently over time to change public opinion. Something that I think folks should always pay attention to is that when the concept of mass deportation was pulled in 2015, 2016, you had somewhere around 20 to 30% of Americans on board. I think maybe even lower. But now when you poll Americans about the concept of mass deportation. You have high 50s, and some polls even show low 60s of Americans supporting mass deportation. And so I think that really shows the conservative project, the way they think about public opinion is they view it that's something that is shaped slowly over time, not really in one election cycle or two election cycles, but multiple years. So they believe that they can ultimately push the American public towards accepting their views because they have a very good and well built out conservative ecosystem that is pumping out their ideas in the media, but then also in the courts. There's a group called the Federalist Society that kind of trains young lawyers to basically go into the legal world and become conservative leaders, conservative bastions of their ideas in judges, in clerkships, and in different ways. So I think for the Conservative Party, some of these strategies, obviously, they're not going to happen in 4 years, but they hope, if Vance becomes president, then you have another 4 years. Let's say Vance loses and you have another Democratic president, but then a Republican comes back in 4 years. You're kind of able to control time by slowly and just steadily pushing these same ideas.
And I do think there is a counterbalance to that, which is how fast is too fast for issues like this? Because I think for Trump one, you saw a good amount of his policy being deeply unpopular with a majority of the country. And only after there was a migrant crisis, there was a quote unquote invasion of the country, did voters really turn around on that issue. And we saw that in this last election. But I don't think in 2020, people had really turned around on the issues that Trump is focusing on. So how fast would it be? How fast is too fast for the Trump administration in these issues? Are they jumping the gun with some of these things?
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think we have to see, I think it's going to come down to how the public responds. I think anytime that any political writer, pundit goes oh, I know exactly how people are going to think about this in a couple of years. They have no idea what they're saying. So I try not to do that too much because it's tempting and you can try to feel like you can. But, I think that's going to be, how far do they go and kind of what is a response, one from the public, the media, but also the Democratic Party. That's something that I don't think we've really hit on. And I think that's a big shape of perception. I was talking to someone that works for a really big legal nonprofit in DC, and they do a lot of communications work. And they mentioned this to me before Trump was sworn in, kind of this idea that when mass deportations start, the Trump administration is going to be watching, as they are right now, how the public responds. Will CNN put a ticker up for tracking the amount of people that have been sent out of the country? How does the media respond is basically going to inform how hard they go. And what you have seen in the last week is the public has actually been pretty okay with the way that they've talked about deportations because they focused on going after violent criminals. And, they just released that they want to start doing deportation camps in Guantanamo Bay, which I think is a huge moral catastrophe. There's some really good reporting at the New York Times that they've been doing for probably the last 15 years or so, tracking people that are going in and out of Guantanamo Bay because the legal system there is a military tribunal, so it's very hard to track. What they've shown is that place has a lot of civil rights violations. And so I think on that point, the Trump administration is very much kind of trying and testing different things to see how people respond. So to answer your question, I think it's going to determine on a couple of different factors. Depends on how the Democratic Party, how much noise they make, how the public responds, but also how the media kind of interprets and kind of spreads their actions.
So I want to hone in on something actually you're hitting on. It's those three pillars of how the opinions change in this public, right? You mentioned the media, CNN, obviously news stations, the Democratic Party, but I'm seeing two issues with those. And are people really getting their opinions from CNN and mainstream news at this point? Same thing with democratic institutions. Having had your background in communications, are people really getting their opinions on policy issues from traditional news sources? I mean, I find it hard to believe that if social media is our dominant factor, So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think that the majority of public is getting their media information from mainstream media. I think what has happened over time is that people just don't trust it anymore for a variety of reasons. I think there's a lot of debates about when this started. There's a really interesting social scientist I read that argues that this started actually in the Clinton era, that Fox News was kind of the creation of conservative media. The way that they covered the Clinton affairs kind of turned conservative media into this like gossip rag. And so, there are a lot of theories about when it started. It's tough for me even to say, but I don't think that a lot of Americans trust traditional media. And so what has happened is that I think you have a lot more conservative people in independent media because mainstream media has very strict rules and regulations about who joins the club. An example of that is the White House Correspondents Association. It's a very elite and prestigious group of people that decide who gets White House press passes. That has been a long practice and a very strict process that they have created. And they have said that is to ensure that the most legitimate media sources are coming in the White House. But what you are seeing with the Trump administration, which is interesting, is they've actually completely removed the White House Correspondents Association from that process. And now they are doing the vetting. And I think what that shows is they are aware of how independent media is becoming a place where people are getting their news. So they want to be in on controlling that because they're aware that mainstream media is not what it used to be anymore. So yeah, I don't think that a lot of people are getting their information from mainstream media.
Yeah. Do you want to just time out on the recording? Do you want to switch to a
620.
different
Sure.
topic? Or
Yeah.
I didn't know if we wanted to switch to something else.
No worries. I put a time stop hands to 6:20, or 16:20. But all right, we'll give it 20 seconds. Yeah, I was like, I was just going to pivot from that to his work with the ACLU.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just curious.
No, all good, man.
Worries.
Cool.
Yeah, no worries. All right, 16:50. Cool. So, given all this, a change in independent media, and obviously these changes to the White House press passes, given independent media, Substack, even this podcast. How do you see that as a communication factor? And in particular, I want you to think of this through the lens of, the ACLU and these other institutions on the other side of the political spectrum, right? These more liberal to left-leaning things. How do you see this as a competition where we're fighting for people's attention, and how do you get there?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So, before I was a contributor with MSNBC, I was at the ACLU, a communications strategist and advisor for the Voting Rights Project, but also on a lot of other civil rights issues and kind of figuring out how do we tell the ACLU story of protecting civil rights to the general public. And I think that's something that the organization is doing now really well, and a lot of other civil rights groups and nonprofit left-aligned groups are doing. And I think if I was there, what I would say is focusing on how can you reach people that aren't in independent media. So that means talking to influencers, talking to podcasts, but then also building your own infrastructure. Something I think that the Republicans have done really well is they have built their own information ecosystem. So instead of being like, we need to get the New York Times, it's like, we can just make a podcast and we can have our guests on. And, the issue is that things like that, scaling it up takes years. It's not going to be done in like a year or two. It's not going to actually be done by 2028. Like, it takes like almost 10 years to scale something like that to the level that it needs to be. One, because you need size, you need correspondence, you need people that are working in this machine of creating news, but also the big thing is you need to have legitimacy, and people don't trust things like that only after they've been listening to them for a long period of time. And they feel like, okay, I know this host, I know XYZ person. For example, like maybe they've been listening to Ben Shapiro for so many years. Like, okay, like I trust him. I've been listening to him since like 2016, 2020. So it's like years of trust you have to build. So, my advice to folks in those places is always just start building right now. You really can't wait. You can't wait until 2026 and say we're going to like do it after the midterms. Start building now because we're already behind. So we just have to move as quick as possible.
So what he's saying is keep listening to Progressive Podcast and where you find your podcasts.
Yes, keep listening to Progressive. Yeah.
What role should regarding that point that independent media and building up that infrastructure is very important for having I don't want to say our own echo chamber, but somebody to represent us online in independent media. How should and how does the establishment, whether that's the mainstream media or the officials inside the Democratic Party, contribute to that? I know there's been a lot of talk about the DNC race, and a lot of people have their own ideas, but I do think that there is also somewhat of a play it safe mentality with a lot of DNC chair candidates. I don't know if you feel the same way. Like what would the biggest shakeup be to this whole system that we have up right now?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely a play it safe mentality amongst a lot of DNC members and some of the folks that are running for leadership positions. And I'll give you an example. So before I was at the ACLU, I was on Capitol Hill working as a press secretary for a member of Congress who's now retired. And I would see all the times in different Democratic offices, the approval process for posting something online is like the most complicated, convoluted process you'd ever see. You'd have a tweet written, and then you'd have like four people sitting there and debating the tweet, whereas you have just like Donald Trump is just posting. He's like the best shit poster ever. And I think like what that does is that, people feel like they trust him more, even though he's a liar, because he's just able to kind of speak his mind. And people are like, I like someone where I feel like I can connect with, because politicians have always been seen to be in this ivory tower that are far away from people, and people can't really interact with their politicians. So I do think there is some of that play it safe mentality in some of the folks running for DNC chair. One of the folks that I think that have really interested me in the DNC race is Faye Shakur. He's running for DNC chair, and I think the way that he views independent media, I think, is really insightful and interesting. The reason why is because he helped launch a page called More Perfect Union, essentially the social media page I think a lot of folks have seen, that talks about labor issues in a really interesting way that's digestible for the general public. So, I think you want someone in that role that has actually scaled digital media before. Because I think a lot of folks that are running for the role are really smart and really talented and have done that work on the ground, but times are changing. You're not going to win a campaign anymore by knocking the most doors. We've seen that happen. The Democrats knocked the most doors, they talked to the most voters, and they still lost the election huge. And so that's showing that there's just a different way to communicate with people. There's a really good book about this called The Medium is the Massage. It's by the sociologist that talks about kind of this idea of how when communication media changes, mediums change, the politicians that are successful will also change. There's a really good story about how Reagan really becomes a successful politician because of TV and because of his ability to be behind the camera and smile and laugh, and being a former actor makes him a more adept politician. If you didn't have television during that time, there's a pretty good argument that he wouldn't be as successful as he was. So I think at the end of the day, the Democratic Party, and folks that are in leadership, I hope don't play it safe. And I think that means leaning on young advisors and just letting them run with their ideas and seeing what happens and not being so afraid of failing.
I think you really hit something that this one's just personal to me. I mean, obviously, I also was obviously not in the role you were, press secretary, but I was a Capitol Hill intern, and it's those layers of like red tape for a tweet. And this is not to dunk on how they do their things, but my time there, I remember writing a tweet, and just for context, right, it was a tweet about, I want to say Labor Day. And I put something about like wishing folks a happy Labor Day, or maybe it was Memorial Day, whatever it was. But it was just, folks, happy Memorial Day. Stay it safe, like have a good weekend, yada yada, right? It went through 5 different people. It took 3 days to get the approval for a tweet. We had to interchange the word families to folks to families on Main Street to all these, pardon my French, just bullshit things of, it's a goddamn tweet about it's a goddamn tweet about a holiday, and it's going to be ignored. It's going to be swiped past the feed, and we're not winning that attention war. But what I want to take with this is that you mentioned something about letting younger people run with their ideas, and of course, DNC chair Faye Shakir, if I'm saying that right. How exactly are we going to bolster these young influencers? I was thinking a lot about those 2 Democrat kids, Harry Sisson and the other blonde kid who I actually have no clue what his name is.
Yeah.
But those guys, they're just appearing everywhere. They're talking. They're kind of annoying. I mean, look, I appreciate the stick. I like what you guys are doing, but
Yeah.
you're just going in there and picking fights. How are we actually going to engage these voters? And like you said, this new medium, it's online. Like, how do we actually engage these people with stuff that's going to stick
Mhm. So an idea that I've seen that I've really liked and I've kind of tried to share with some folks, I think the DNC needs to start a YouTube news page, something kind of stationed like a PragerU page, where you kind of are talking about democratic values constantly, but also talking about the strong, rich history of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about the great things that FDR did, talking about the great things that former past presidents, Barack Obama, JFK have done. And that's something that I think that the Republicans have done really well is they've created this narrative of the past of Republicans on PragerU and on these YouTube sites. So I think it's a place that I would really like to see the Democratic Party engage with, because we don't really engage with YouTube platforms. Another thing I think I'd like to see the Democratic Party do, this is for elected officials, senators, and members of Congress, is more direct to camera videos. An elected official that has done this really well after the election is Senator Chris Murphy. I think he's taken really big advantage of social media and speaking to people and letting them know about the disastrous things that Donald Trump has done and making sure that he's reaching them where they are. Because Democrats always say after the election, it's been a constant refrain that I've heard everywhere, we want to reach people where they are. And I'm like, okay, if you really want to do that, you have to invest in digital media. You have to invest in these places where people are. And then the conversation just goes, we need to knock more doors and invest in organizing. So then I'm like, you actually don't want to invest in where people are. So I think we really need to decide if we want to reach where people are. Because if you want to reach where people are, the answer is going harder on digital.
You have to reach people who are doom scrolling on TikTok, basically.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Well, and how do you break through that? I mean, it's an algorithm, and something I kind of want to tie into that is that whole nonprofit like feedback loop of the word policing, of tone policing. How do you see that playing out? I mean, it's social media. You have to be quick. You have to be effective. You know, I really believe that that whole federal funding freeze, the fact that you didn't have all 47 Democratic senators or whatever it was going on TikTok and just holding the phone, being like, take a look at this. Trump shut down like Meals on Wheels for veterans, or like any number of things. Why are we pretending like we have to be some perfectly scripted, use every word correctly? Like, it's, let them go up and be them. One of my big gripes with especially the Biden communications team was, let Biden go up and be weird. He's a little funky. He says strange things. Let him go up and do that. Let him, instead of having him sit there and script and read off a billboard, have him just go up there and say crazy things. Like, that's what he's good at. Have him be a little weird. Make it, yeah, the president's a little weird, but we like him. Like, why that? And how do you see that actually taking shape? I mean, how do we break out of this like perfect little bubble of, we have to say everything correctly, we have to make sure everything's perfect?
So I think the reason why this happens a lot in Democratic circles is because a lot of Democrats are smart. And I think what happens is when you are smart and you're well read, you tend to overthink every simple thing you do. I say this as someone that's in law school right now. I'm literally being trained to overthink every single thing. That's what the degree, it's what I'm paying for them to teach me. And so I think you have a lot of people in the Democratic Party that kind of have that mentality. And I think it's ultimately hampered us because the social media environment, the environment that people are in right now, they don't want politicians that are so uptight. They want them to be relaxed. They want to see them in public. They want to feel like they can touch them and react and relate to them. I think on your second point on language, and I think really, I guess, like PC culture, I guess that's the word. I think something that has become clear is that the Democratic Party for a long time has had this strategy of how to talk about social issues, and they thought that it would bring out minority voters in droves. There's a really good book about this, two really good books about this. The first is called The Expanding the Democratic Majority by Ruth Teixeira. The second is called Elite Capture. In the first book, it talks about this idea of really how in the early 2000s, before Obama, a lot of political theorists had this idea that the country was becoming more diverse, and all you had to focus in on was racial diversity to turn out minority voters, and they would support you. That has obviously not happened. This past election, we saw Latino voters and Black voters go towards the Republican Party in ways that we haven't seen in years. And what really concerns me is that if we stay attached to this idea of just messaging and using these PC and diversity lingo terms and not actually speaking to Black and Latinos' real concerns about changing their lives and benefiting their economic situation, we're going to keep losing these voters and the bottom will actually fall out. And I think that would be really bad. Because right now in this election in 2024, you saw Latino voters vote for Donald Trump, I think 46 to 48% of the way. And if you're a Democrat, you're not going to win the presidency if 48% of Latinos are voting for a Republican. Like, you're just not going to win. So I think we really have to think about how we're doing outreach to these groups, because the theory for years that we could essentially just speak in more diverse terms and speak in this PC lingo and to reach these diverse voters, it's not working. And another point I think I want to make on this, and it's in this book, Elite Capture, it's one of my favorite books, is the idea of really PC policing or PC culture and language. It's not really something that is actually benefiting these minority groups tangibly. And a lot of these programs that corporations are putting out, they actually don't lead to higher minorities in these executive roles. And this book kind of talks about how a lot of PC language and all this like kind of culture around this stuff actually doesn't lead to reaching more minorities and bringing them in the political process. So I think Democrats have to really take a step back and think about their strategy that they've been doing for the last 10 years and think about, is it actually reaching the voters that we need to keep in our coalition?
Yeah, and I think it's also really interesting that the Latino voter base heavily shifted to the right for someone who, like you kind of mentioned, the Democratic idea that we need more focus on these issues for POCs. We need more people in Congress who represent these people. Not saying that you can't have those things, and those things are important, but 48% of Latinos, like you said, voted for someone who is actively trying to deport a large number of Latino people here, and who is a really wealthy, rich, old white guy who is just tweeting from his toilet. And so it's kind of an interesting like disconnect there also. One thing that I also like have heavily noticed is that beyond the background, like the racial background of people in Congress, there is also a huge disconnect between the career background that people had before they came into Congress. For Democrats, I think it's the vast majority. I don't remember the exact number, but a large majority of Democratic people in Congress are had careers as lawyers before they went into politics. Is that also something that, like you said, people in Congress are overthinking their media strategy, don't exactly know how to be more human and less robotic? Is that also something that should play into the calculus? Is like, we need more people from medical backgrounds or education backgrounds, or maybe media. You mentioned Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Those are both great examples of people who had large success because of their media background. Is that something that Democrats also should be focusing on, or is it retooling the people that we already have there?
So I think it's both. I think it's, retooling the folks that we have there and kind of letting people know that the way to reach more people is to just be authentically yourself. Something that advice I give to Democratic members of Congress right now is your Twitter account. Put it on your phone and stop. I mean, your staff can tweet from it now and then, but you should be tweeting from it every couple hours. Don't talk about politics. Like, if you're into TV, you're into sports, you're into like cooking, you're into like whatever you're into, start tweeting about it, because you're going to build a community of people that are not just interested in you about politics, but interested in you for what you're interested in, your passions, your hobbies. And I think that shows that a politician is reaching people, and that's what people want to see. They want to connect with their politicians. And so I think that's something we need to do, is retooling folks that are in office and letting them know that there's a way to communicate with people better. I think also at the same time, I think definitely bringing in folks with more diverse backgrounds. I see this as a law student, bringing in folks that are in the medical field, in business, because we want to show people that we have a diverse elected official group that reaches different parts of the American economy. And so when they're voting, they have this special skill set in so many different parts of our economy.
I did want to ask a follow-up question real quick. I think I agree with you. Definitely Democratic politicians should be more authentic in their communications. But I also think a similar point that people like something similar argument that people make is that we need like a Joe Rogan of the left. I'm sure you've heard this, where we need to have someone who has left leaning values that fulfills a Joe Rogan type role. And I think one argument against that I heard that was very interesting was that Joe Rogan's appeal to the right wing is not because he's someone who talked about politics and then got into MMA and UFC and things like that. He was somebody who started as a UFC fighter, as a sitcom actor, whatever he was, and then he started talking about politics. Is it possible to make that jump? The connection that I'm trying to make is, can you make that jump from talking about politics to being authentic, or will people just kind of see that as disingenuous?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I totally agree with everything you said. And I think that's why when people say we need a liberal Joe Rogan, it's kind of ridiculous because one, Joe Rogan voted for Bernie Sanders. He had these liberal positions. It just was when he decided not to be liberal anymore, which I think is something that we could probably back for a long time. As someone that I listen to Joe Rogan, I've listened for years. And I think that happened when his ideals changed, but also I think that happened when I think Democrats just never took those places really seriously. They always thought it was a joke. They thought these were just weird podcasts where people talk about UFOs and conspiracy theories and MMA, and they weren't places that they really wanted to go to talk to people. But after this election, they're now realizing, oh shit, we actually need to invest in those places. So I think the idea of a liberal Joe Rogan is kind of just, it shows that almost Democrats kind of don't understand what's going on, because the whole appeal again is that he was not a political figure. He was an MMA fighter. He was a stand-up comedian, and then later got into politics. So I think for Democrats, it's not really creating a liberal Joe Rogan. It's going into the spaces that already exist and talking about your values and understanding that there may be some hostility, but if 10% of people listen to a podcast episode or a kind of maybe conversation out of a conservative podcast and they come away being more skeptical of Donald Trump's vision for the country, you won.
You know, that's a really good point. I was gonna say, so when you say going into these like hostile positions, right? Obviously, it's a different strategy of broadening your tent. You know, you don't win more voters by appealing to your base. You go out and you find new ones to make it bigger. But I want to pivot this into, you know, your time as an aide for Senator Bob Casey. Obviously, he lost Pennsylvania. It was supposed to be a pretty simple win for him. Obviously, polling had him ahead, but what happened? Did he like not go in these spaces? Can you tell us a little about what happened and maybe filter all these things you've been saying through the lens of Bob Casey's race in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so you know, I got to be in full transparency. I wasn't working on the most recent campaign, so I didn't really see what was happening, some of the decisions that they were making. And Senator Casey is a great boss of mine, and it was obviously disappointing to see him lose. But from my perspective, I think something that happened this election that was clear to me is that, you know, he was in office for a while, a good amount of time. And I think Pennsylvania voters and voters around the country wanted someone new in general. They're very much tired of the status quo. And Bob Casey very much was attached to the status quo, not only by his own election as a senator, but his family was also in politics. His father was governor of Pennsylvania. So the Casey name not only carries the Biden legacy, his own legacy, it carries years of prior Democratic politics. So, you know, I think he was really running in a change election. And when you're running in a change election where you're representing the last like 40 years of Pennsylvania politics, I don't think it's going to go well for you. And then on top of that, everyone is angry with Democrats for rising prices. So I think that's tough. I think something that really stood out to me about McCormick's strategy was really using some of that messaging, but also really reminding Pennsylvania voters that he's just a normal Republican, which I thought was interesting. And I say this as a Pennsylvania voter and live here right now. The biggest issue that Pennsylvania Republicans have had in the state for so long is candidate quality. They recruit the shittiest candidates. For example, Doug Mastriano that ran against Shapiro was this conspiracy guy. He made no sense. He was saying all this weird shit about chemtrails, and he got smoked by Shapiro in the election. And Republicans in Pennsylvania have had that problem for a long time. But for the first time, what you saw with McCormick was they actually just ran a normal Republican, similar to the last Republican governor and last Republican senator in Pennsylvania. Dave McCormick, military background, business background, worked for George Bush. Like he's not some MAGA lunatic. He was literally a neocon for multiple years working in the Bush administration. So he just was like, I'm a normal business guy, Republican. I'm not going to like screw up your taxes. I'm not going to touch your health care. Like I'm normal. And he won that election. So I think, there are a couple things there that ultimately led to, I think, Bob Casey's ultimate loss in that election. I do think the communication stuff played a role. It's something that I honestly haven't had a chance to dig into in Pennsylvania too much, because I think in some of these states like Pennsylvania, where you have rural voters, the internet plays a lot more of a kind of role. And I didn't see Dave McCormick too much in some of these conservative spaces on the internet, but I do think his strategy of really being a normal Republican and a change agent really led to him winning that race.
Interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Dylan. Don't let me cut you
No,
off.
you go ahead. You go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to say, I mean, it's an interesting topic, really. I have all my thoughts, of course, on the candidate quality and all these things, underperformances, overperformances. We could always chalk it up to money, and I'm sure you saw all the discourse of, oh, he wasn't campaigning enough. He thought it was a slam dunk. It's like, okay, like let's get off Twitter. Let's just remember there are actual people that do things, not just sit on this app and filter whatever we see. But I think with that Dave McCormick strategy, right, of I'm a normal Republican, how much of that do you think really would have worked better for Democrats? I mean, you think Ruben Gallego or Alyssa Slotkin, how many of them pulled the I'm just a normal Democrat, and it's the opposite side of the coin of, instead of I'm a normal Republican and I'm not going to like raise taxes and I'm not going to cut your health care, it's I'm a normal Democrat. I just want to make sure people have health care and make enough money, and I want to make sure you have the things you need. Like, how much of that is just being normal? Like, I do wonder, are people just tired of Ivy League educated, I want to include this messaging thing with the word policing, because this is the one that kills me. I grew up in Southern California, right? My town was 50-50, 50 white, 50 Latino. It was very clear to me that it's like, you speak Spanish, everyone understands these things. You do not use the word Latine or Latinx, because that is just so, I mean, I have never seen like hatred burn in someone's eyes when you refer to them as that, because that it's just insulting. And how much of that is just, well, we can just be normal. Just talk to people like, no, I'm a normal Democrat. I just want you to have a nice house to live in and have healthcare, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think folks like Ruben Gallego and Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan, I think the reason why they're so successful is they did that, but also I think they really didn't run and this is kind of unfortunate, they didn't really like run alongside the Harris campaign per se. They really ran their own distinct races, as being like, this race is about me, it's not about Kamala Harris. And I think there's some people that ran in 2024 very much being like, I am like running to continue the Biden Harris legacy. When it was for them, it was like, oh, I'm running because I care about the people of Michigan, and this is my own race and my own ideas. I may even sometimes be against the Democratic Party on some stuff. I may disagree with the party, but that honestly shows that I have my own mind. And that's something that has really stood out in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman, senator here. A lot of Democrats online don't like him for, I think, a lot of different positions, and I disagree with the senator on many issues. But I think something that makes him popular in Pennsylvania is that he has his own opinions and beliefs about things that are different from people. And Pennsylvania voters like people that are independent minded. And it's really been the way our state has always gone in our statewide officials. Folks that are independent minded, that are even willing to buck their party a little bit, tend to do well. For example, Dave McCormick came out a couple of days ago and was like, thankfully, the Trump administration cleared up the freeze. This was ridiculous. Kind of showing that, he understands, kind of sees like kind of the reality in Pennsylvania. Like, you have to be kind of this independent person. He couldn't just be like, the fake woke media has made up the spending freeze, which is like what, if you're a MAGA diehard or, MAGA member in the House, that's what you say. But he realized that, he's in Pennsylvania. This is a swing state. Pennsylvania voters like independent-minded elected officials. He had to be careful about how he talked.
And I think it's an interesting connection that you make that I think is kind of counterintuitive, but it makes sense for the political reality we're in, which is that more more center leaning people might be seen as more independent thinking, whereas if you were to think back maybe just even 10, 15 years ago, it's like if someone was more independent thinking, if you label them that way, they might have been seen as more extreme. Why do you think that shift is? Is it because the extremes of each party are more dogmatic than they used to be, or is there another play? Is there another factor going on?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think the media is kind of like hyped up both sides, like the extreme wings of both sides. I by no means, I don't think the same at all. But I think the media has very much created this perception that they're both the same. So when someone is not in either camp and you're in a state that is purple, I think you do better because you can speak to voters in the middle.
Right. Yeah. And I also had a follow-up question to what you were saying earlier, which is that Dave McCormick was this like centrist-leaning, more normal kind of conservative that Pennsylvanians could trust. Do you think that, from my perspective, it seems like, especially in swing states, it seems like that is not actually the norm anymore. It's the exception, and Dave McCormick is the exception, especially in this circumstance when you have Kerry Lake running in Arizona or Dave Mastriano running. Do you think after Trumpism, after Trump's party, does the status quo return? Obviously, this is like a pie in the sky kind of vision that Democrats will have. Oh, Trump will just leave and everything will go back to normal. But is that trend going to continue, or are people really going to be loyal to Trump after his term ends? If you don't have an answer, that's fine. I just was curious.
So no, I think that's interesting. I'm kind of, I guess I'll like think this through while I give my answer. So I think this is all predicated on how the next 4 years go. If these tariffs happen and they bankrupt the economy and we have another 2008 situation, which I think is actually very possible, because in combination with tariffs, I think the amount of money that is being pumped into the AI crypto space, if that bubble bursts and there's not enough innovation to keep up with the amount of investment that has been made, you'll see another financial crisis. If you spend like trillions of dollars on these AI servers and nothing gets built and it ends up not producing at the level that you want it to, you'll see another financial crisis like in 2008 where the housing bubble burst. So I think it depends really how the administration goes. I think that pending COVID, Donald Trump wins a second term in 2020. I really do think that. I think if he finishes this term, you have like some crises that happen, but the economy is relatively stable. We're not involved in a foreign war in Greenland or Panama or wherever the hell they're trying to else invade or go to. I can't keep up. I think you could see Donald Trump kind of being this father-like leadership figure of the party in the way that Obama is, in the sense that, if you're running in a competitive statewide election, Obama comes. And it's like this whole fanfare and the base of the party gets really excited. And I really do think that Trump could become that figure, but it just depends on how this term goes.
Oh, Max, you're muted.
So I was going to say, I didn't want to interrupt, but I'm like, sorry, I'm just thinking about that as a logistical issue. I love that principle, right? I mean, obviously you've seen it when Obama comes, we roll out the red carpet and everyone goes like, oh my God, it's like 2008 again. But Trump's old. I mean, he's going to be 82 when he leaves. I mean, do you really think he'll still have that staying power as he continues to get older and older? And, instead of just talking about windmills and it's 2020 and he's like, okay, seriously, this is 45 minutes of it. It's going to be Ben Affleck is Batman. It's like, okay, that was 20 years ago, Trump. It's time to go back to the home. Like, do you see that at all as being different?
I would say that, but just this guy and the way that he's been able to be very resilient in the face of challenges, I want to say like no, but his past like ability to bounce back very quickly, to kind of use his ramblings as a sign of competence, in the sense that he was able to say, I ramble so much. And he said this on Joe Rogan's podcast, because I'm connecting all these different issues together. And Joe Rogan sat there being like, oh my God, you're so smart. Like, that's a really good point. You're such a genius. And, I was listening, I was like, oh my God, this is such bullshit. But I think that he has, like, he's a very charismatic politician. And so it's tough to say if that's going to happen. I really think we have to see, because there is a chance that he could just really age rapidly in a way that no one knows, and he could be in a wheelchair and just could be very infirm and cannot communicate in the way that he used to. And this is really the golden age, as he said, for his life. So we got to see. I think we just have to see. Yeah.
Interesting. It's like in the same way, like Biden kind of, I don't want to say again faltered, but as he got older, he started to shuffle. I just want to point something out on the side. You remember did you see the article about like what caused the shuffle, like how he would walk his feet, right, with like the fractured foot? Did you happen to see anything about that?
So wasn't it because he had an
Playing with the dog.
accident in the beginning of his term, and essentially he didn't want to get it fixed, and then it ended up to be this permanent infirmity, which is almost like kind of shows you the way that he thinks. There's a really good book. It's called The Last Politician.
Franklin
It's
Foer?
about Joe Biden, and I always recommend it to people to read, because once you read it, the whole election makes total sense as to why it didn't drop out. Yeah,
100%. I mean, like I was gonna say, if for any of the folks in the audience, we'll link the Franklin Foer's book in below. But the whole thing is just he's very a prideful, proud, like doesn't like to take a no as an answer kind of guy, and it's I don't know. Something about just reading that, like, I'm sorry, you fractured your foot playing with your dog and you wouldn't treat it, and now you have a shot. I just saw that and like, look, I've worked as a personal trainer and a corrective exercise specialist for 4 years now, right? It's everything I do. The idea of someone being that prideful and just like completely changing their ability to walk over not wanting to wear a boot for a couple months. Like, are
crazy.
I don't know how to say this, but are you fucking kidding me? Like,
no,
dude.
Exactly. Exactly. And then, I remember now looking back, it's almost like just like this is the moments. I remember when he fell off the bike. That was like I don't know if you guys remember that whole moment. It was a whole it was like a week-long media cycle of just him falling off that bike. And so it makes total sense why the American people didn't take him seriously. I mean, now we're here. Yeah.
Well, and it's insane because like, you ever seen those things where it's like, oh, he has no aura, and like, look, credit where credit is true. Trump got shot in the ear, and his reaction was like, wait, this is a political moment, and he went like that. Look, you don't have to agree with him on anything, but getting shot in the ear and then pumping your fist like that. That's badass. Like that picture. Look, I know that. I mean, look, I fell for it. I thought people weren't going to care. Same thing with the McDonald's thing. Pardon my French, but that shit has aura, right? That was cool. People looked at that and was like, oh, that's cool. The whole thing of Biden is like, oh, every clip you saw of him was just the Medicare. And it's like, okay, dude, get on there and talk about how you're going to take Trump behind the bar and beat the shit out of him. Bring back 2016 Joe. Say some weird shit. Like, have some personality. Make us think you're alive.
No, totally. I remember I was actually at like a Democratic fundraiser, funny enough, when the really horrific shooting happened in Butler. And I remember someone showed me the photo of him with his fist in the air, and I was like, oh man, I'm not going to see the end of this till November. Like, this is going to be on t-shirts, because it was really this historic moment. And kind of looking back, it's almost like I'm a big reader of history, love reading about American history, American politics, American presidents, and like anytime a president gets shot, they kind of become like almost this messianic figure in American politics and history. We've seen it with Lincoln, with Reagan especially. After his shooting, the way that the American public viewed Reagan, JFK especially, horrific tragedy. And I think that's kind of what has happened to him. I mean, knock on wood, we got to see how this term goes, and we got to see what happens. And he's obviously starting off on a very bad foot here. But I do think that some of those instances during the campaign, that shooting and the McDonald's moment, these like memeable, funny things, really helped him out.
You can say that again. It's like I did not see the end. Like literally, he got shot, and I have people who have never posted on Instagram once before. It's like I'm opening my phone, being like, beep, beep. It's just him getting shot. I'm like, you don't care about like why are we hey, but it was badass.
Yep.
But given that, I mean, obviously you said you live in Pennsylvania, right? You're going to law school there.
Yeah.
Pray for me because I got to get in this cycle. We're gonna see what happens. But
best of luck.
If I hear the word law school one more time, I'm just gonna go live in the forest. But I want to talk to you one about Philadelphia as a whole, right? You said something about the independent streak, but that's not exactly what I'm interested in. I'm interested about the Philadelphia Eagles and what the hell happens if you guys win the Super Bowl, right?
Well, if we win, the city will probably be cratered to oblivion. It's going to be a shit show. It's going to be interesting. I'm a big Eagles fan. Go Birds! Excited. I think this is a game that we've been waiting for, especially getting the Chiefs again. I mean, that sweet, sweet revenge, as they say. If we can pull this off, would be great. We've really fixed our backfield. We got Saquon Barkley in the back that has just added so much support for Jalen Hurts. We're great on the wings. We got AJ Brown, Devontae. Like, it's perfect. It's really everything coming together. The things I'm concerned about in that game, I guess, just Mahomes is Mahomes. Like, there's some times where you watch Mahomes and he's like practically on the ground and he throws a pass and it's just Kelsey or someone else is there. We got Pacheco in the backfield, very efficient running back that is getting serious yardage. So I guess my worry is that Jalen Hurts or some of the Eagles make one or two mistakes, and that leads to our demise, because that's what happened last time. A fumble basically screwed up the game, and the Chiefs make no mistakes ever. They're a really well-run team. They're very similar to the Brady Patriots era, where they didn't make any mistakes. Very disciplined team. So I think that's my worry is, I'm going to say to folks at home, if you're watching the game and anytime the Eagles turn over the ball, that is like a 5% more chance they lose the game. Because the Chiefs aren't going to have any turnovers probably. So anytime the Eagles have a turnover, it's going to be trouble.
I was going to say, that's what killed the Bills. Not to be Mr. Bills Mafia here, but that's what killed us. Was it last Sunday? Whatever it was. It's like,
yeah.
You have too many turnovers, and it's like they're so disciplined. They're not letting that slide. It's not like you make a mistake and you fumble it, and then all of a sudden they're going to ignore it. It's like, no, they see that, and it's
they're
over.
Scoring.
It's. Yeah, I gotta say, I was just sad. I kept getting Josh Allen edits, and I was like, man, I was praying for it. We had the nation behind us and couldn't do it.
Yeah, I have to say, and maybe it's a question for you. As a Bills fan, do you want to change QBs? Or are you kind of just he's your guy? But the thing is, I don't know is this the fourth loss against the Chiefs or the third? Yeah, so this is 4. You have to, if you're in the management of the Bills, you probably are thinking
we got to change it.
Got to change something. I don't know. I don't know though. I don't know.
Look, full transparency. For many, many years, I declared football as a complete time sink. But after 21 years at this point, I was like, nope. You know what? I've decided. Despite being born and raised in LA, I was like, I'm taking up my mom, my grandfather, my uncles, all the side of the family as a Bills fan. And after that, I was like, okay, it's supposed to be a rebuild year. It's and Josh Allen's great. I mean, here's the thing: we got to give him credit where credit is due. He's great. This was supposed to be a rebuild year. It's one of those things where the team itself is on the ups, but it's the Chiefs. It's like you said. It's like the Brady Patriots. You just can't. You don't have room for error with that, and it makes you these just undeniable underdogs, right? Every time you go against them, you're just kind of and it's hard because you always want to have that hope of maybe we pull it through this time, but they're disciplined. I mean, they have, like you said, nothing can go wrong. And it's that's just not how it works. I mean, we pray for the best, but that's what they do,
Yeah.
2010s Raptors versus LeBron James. It's just that undefeatable wall that you can't get through.
Yep.
I think my prediction for the Eagles is if Saquon Barkley is hovering around the 40 to 50 yard rushing range, and by the first half, I think that's a pretty good sign that everything might be going to shit. If he's not able to get through the run game, if he's not able to get through the D-line, which the Chiefs have insane talent on that end, it's you need him to just lock in, because the Eagles team, to me, I don't know the depth chart up and down, but it feels very much like the same team as in 2022. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe an Eagles fan will say differently. They've changed enough.
Yeah, I do agree that it is kind of the same team from 2022, but I think the backfield, Saquon, and I think the wide receivers now are just a bit more mature. I think in 2022, they'd come out of college, and so they were still kind of trying to find their footing in the NFL. But I think, A.J. Brown now is a lot more efficient. And gets open more quickly than before. So I think they're going to they're a better team, but I do agree, rushing yards, if they aren't hitting those numbers, it's going to be tough. I think any turnover is basically almost a death wish. Yeah.
Yeah, you're a doomsayer, Rotimi. We need to make sure
I
that doesn't
think
happen.
knock on wood, I'm knocking all over the place. I just think as an Eagles fan, I just have so much anxiety about this because I think the last game, the city was so excited, and as an Eagles fan, I was so excited, and everyone was so excited, and it just was like the most brutal loss. Just watching that fumble, I mean, I think I watched that like play for weeks after, and so this time, I'm just trying to not get my heart broken so fast, you know.
You like
Yeah.
cautiously holding your breath, being like, no fumbles, no fumbles, no fumbles,
Yeah.
like nothing.
No fumbles, no turnovers. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, with football, with Trump, is there anything else you wanted to bring up? You mentioned a lot of books. Any other book recommendations that you want to give to the audience?
That's a good
I know I need to
question.
read more, so
Yeah, no, I think for me, the big reason, about 2 or 3 years ago, I had this like real crisis, just like a personal crisis in my life where I felt like I'm on Twitter, I'm on social media, where I felt like I just like couldn't pay attention to anything anymore, where I felt like my brain was like actually like being destroyed by social media, and I like couldn't focus on things. I was in law school, and it was really tough to like read long like paragraphs of information, and I started talking to a friend about it, had the same issue, and what they explained to me was like, you've really kind of hurt your attention ability by being on social media because that's how it's designed. So I've really spent the last couple of years trying to read a lot. I try to read a book every month, just to really help with my attention and not be on my phone, not be on Twitter and Instagram as much, on TikTok. And a really good book I just read that I want to recommend to everyone is called Ascent to Power by Robert Caro. It's part of this longer series about LBJ, and it's kind of the like, if you're interested in politics or any American history, like these are the books you got to start with, in my opinion, because you learn about the Democratic Party while reading this series of books, but you also learn about the Great Depression, about the turn of World War II, about FDR, and LBJ is this character in the back of it, and the book does a good job of showing, especially in Ascent to Power, how he's this little guy in the background of all these really big historical moments, just kind of waiting for his moment to eventually grab power. And so I just finished the first book last week. It was really powerful, really interesting, just really funny too. The writer Robert Caro is really older. Robert has been around for a while, so I definitely would recommend that book. It's long, but once you start it, you won't be able to put it down.
That's a good rank. I was gonna say I love Robert Caro's. Obviously, this whole LBJ series, just you can't beat it. It's like it's top of the list. What about Substacks or like what about those? I mean, obviously we have a lot of independent publications. Any of them off the top that you've been really big fan of?
So I've been really liking. So John Gantz wrote a really good book, When the Clock Broke, which is really about the Republicans in the 80s and 90s, and his Substack. I think it's Popular Front. Is really great. And then a podcast I really enjoyed, Know Your Enemy. The guys there, yeah. They're really progressive, of course. Love the progressive fellas. But Know Your Enemy is a great podcast. Really enjoy that one. Popular Front Substack. Like Matt Iglesias Substack. Really great. Some nice, some hot takes in there. I think in Substacks, I'm trying to think. That's about it. I think I've been doing a lot of book reading and a lot of I have a group chat with my friends and people are sharing articles in there. And so that's how I kind of get my news with podcasts. Oh, another good podcast I'd recommend, Breaking Points. Fantastic. I love Sagar and Crystal. I know I met both of them before, fantastic reporters, and they do a really good job of showing the news through kind of both sides of the political spectrum. And I think if you're a liberal that is kind of curious about how conservatives think about the news, Sagar isn't a MAGA guy, but he definitely voted for Trump, and he is someone that is more on the centrist side of things. And hearing him talk about news, I disagree with it sometimes, but it's a refreshing perspective that's different. So I really enjoy that podcast.
Great. And one wrap-up question. Where can people find you, Rotimi? What, Twitter, YouTube, anything like that?
Definitely. So I'm on Twitter, Instagram. So it's at rotimi .a_, and there you'll find my website and everything about me. So give me a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and love to have you.
Awesome. We'll go ahead and tag you. We'll go ahead and place all his information below. Same thing, we'll be linking our Substacks and these book recommendations. Absolutely worth our time. I want to thank you again for coming on today. This has been Progressive, and we will always see you next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.